Hello, everybody. We are back with Ambassador Chas Freeman, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and a U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, who will give us an update on his take of what is currently going on in world affairs. Ambassador Freeman, welcome back.
Thank you, Pascal. Good to be with you.
Let's start maybe with just very recent news, at least as we are speaking today on my December 12th, your December 11th. The United States just seized a oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, and this to me is quite an escalation from where we were before in terms of international relations and also in terms of what's going on with Venezuela. How do you interpret this act?
Well, rather typically for our times, the American media are focused entirely on the pragmatic aspect of this, that it is an escalation of pressure against Nicolas Maduro and the government of Venezuela. But others, including myself, look at it with some dismay because it is essentially an act of piracy. It is the seizure of a ship for no reason. There is a weak legal justification given for this, that the ship has been involved, allegedly, in transporting oil to Lebanon from Iran. Hezbollah supposedly involved in this, and so forth, and that this therefore puts it under American sanctions. But American sanctions are unilateral. They have no standing under international law. They do not excuse the seizure of the ship, and they certainly do not excuse the confiscation of the cargo, which President Trump has indicated is the likely result. So this is an escalation against Venezuela. It is also an act that is utterly illegal under international law. And it is a reminder, if we needed one at this point in history, that the United Nations was founded on the assumption that the 5 permanent members and other members of the Security Council would enforce the Charter and international law, not exempt client states from the application of the law, and not ignore international law with respect to their own actions. Of course, I suppose the genius of this was mainly directed at preventing warfare among the permanent members of the Security Council and those they had defeated in World War II, Germany and Japan. But still, it's proven in recent years, there's absolutely no attention whatsoever by the United States in particular to the particulars of international law, which we simply ignore and violate at will.
Can we maybe also speak about the larger context that shipping in general is now obviously a target of warfare? I mean, this ship was first and foremost also seized in international waters, which even as a unilateral act actually cannot be done, at least not on the current rules. There used to be a concept in the before the 19th century of prize courts and so on, where states would just seize each other's ships, but that was already an considered acts of war, and now we are seeing that also other oil tankers of the so-called shadow fleet, which is not a thing, which is just like non British insured ships, tankers of that transport oil from and to Russia, are being attacked by Ukrainian drones on the high sea. I mean, this is all highly problematic, since these are essentially international waters that must be open to anyone and everyone.
Well, this is exactly why I mentioned the UN Charter and international law, because the UN Charter and international law have essentially been shredded in many, many respects. One puts forward the legal arguments in particular circumstances. So, for example, the United States, even though it has not ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, repeatedly cites it in this context of the South China Sea. That's because it's able to find clauses in it which appear to buttress U.S. arguments against Chinese or other countries' behavior. Of course, we behave selectively. Vietnam does exactly the same things China does, but we never mention that. We only criticize China. I might add that you're in Japan, and there is an island, or actually a bunch of rocks, called Okina Torishima, which is way out in the middle of nowhere. And Japan cites that because it's got a structure on it, which is habitated, cites that as the basis of an exclusive economic zone in a huge area of the Pacific. And this is, of course, entirely inconsistent with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But everybody cherry picks the law to prove whatever it is they want to prove. Actually, the only action against ships that I have seen recently that is consistent with international law is the Yemeni attacks on vessels bound for Israel, which they attack under the authority of the Genocide Convention, which places a positive duty on all countries to do what they can to prevent genocide. But of course, the United States actually spent $1 billion trying to bring Yemen to heel in order to protect Israel and prevent those attacks on shipping. It didn't work. But we're now, of course, as you indicated, seeing attacks on shipping in more and more contexts, and the whole fabric of law that protected this sort of interaction between states is dispensed with.
Is this, in your view, an indicator also for the shift just in power and the escalation, in a stable system, acts like these that heavily infringe upon norms, especially of the law of the sea, are just less likely. We haven't seen those for the last 30 or so years. I mean, the example that you gave with Japan and Takeshima and others is, in a sense, classic, because the Philippines has similar questions. China has whether, islands generate an exclusive economic zone, rocks and features, they don't. So this is kind of still within the bounds of what we are used to when our countries argue their cases. But seizing ships and blowing them up also in the high sea for Ukraine and so on, that is new now, isn't it? Or at least for the last 30, 40 years new.
Yes, no, this is, we're in a period of the breakdown of global norms. It's interesting, you mentioned the various claims in the South China Sea and so forth. Of course, there was a UN Convention on the Law of the Sea arbitral tribunal, which considered the question, precisely only the question of whether islands that are barely inhabitable or only artificially inhabitable could cast an economic zone, as opposed to a territorial sea, which they can do. And of course, the tribunal had no authority to rule on issues of sovereignty, but its finding has been distorted to suggest that China has no valid claim to sovereignty. Maybe it doesn't, but the arbitral tribunal didn't address that question. And so we have, as I mentioned, Okina Torishima is also an atoll that the United States, I think Johnson Atoll in the United States, which the United States claims casts an EEZ, when it doesn't. I mean, there's nobody there. It's not inhabited, it's not inhabitable, except by entirely artificial means. So we have a breakdown of law, where law is simply used as a tool of polemics and not heeded as a guidance to action. I want to make a point here that the epitome of this really is the latest U.S. national security strategy, which of course isn't a strategy. It's a collection of contradictory statements and praise of President Trump for his peacemaking efforts and other things. But it basically asserts a right of the United States under a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine to ignore the sovereignty of every country in the Western Hemisphere while demanding that every other country respect American sovereignty. And we're seeing this played out with the boat murders off Venezuela, where the United States Navy is murdering people on the basis of very flimsy suspicions with no evidence produced, no due process. And in any event, the murder of people carrying drugs is not justified under international law. The normal procedure in our own manuals, as well as in international conventions, is that if you suspect that that contraband is being transported, you board the vessel and search the vessel. And if it is contraband, you can confiscate it. And you can bring legal charges against those transporting the contraband. But you can't just kill them. And especially you can't kill them after you've killed most of them, and two of them are hanging on to debris, survived the first attack for 45 minutes. And there's a positive duty under international law in those circumstances to aid the survivors, not to murder them. And this was actually applied in a famous case where a U-boat captain failed to rescue survivors. So, I mean, in World War II, German U-boat captain. So I think we're seeing a complete breakdown of the fabric of international order that we've been accustomed to.
Yeah, and I mean I'm very glad that you're pointing this out. Even if all of the accusations of that the United States leveled against these civilians in the Caribbean were true, even if all of it was true, the murder of these people would still be under international law, and actually even under U.S. domestic law, illegal, and especially then killing the survivors. I mean, it's horrendous. It's surprising to me that the U.S. media still labels this as suspected breaches of the law.
No, I
mean,
think
somebody shooting somebody else in the street in the head and then reporting as suspected murder. That's
no, I mean, I think the press is behaving in a thoroughly, disgustingly irresponsible fashion. They're just acting as scribes for the government rather than independent reporters.
May I ask on the this national security strategy is on the one hand interesting because it also contains elements that are actually de-escalatory, especially with regard to Russia and China. On the other hand, at the very same time, we see that now Congress actually is working on a bill that would make it impossible for the US to reduce its troop size in Europe, and also not, I mean, by law, require the US president to not give up the military leadership of NATO. What's the name? Sakr, the supreme commander of the forces in NATO, right? While of course the US demands 5% expense, right, of 5% of GDP that NATO members should come up with. So, I mean, overall, there's no real change in U.S. policy toward Europe, is there?
What has happened is the Trump administration, in this so-called strategy, has transformed European allies into auxiliaries in the struggle against China. That is to say, there's no need for the United States to consider the interests of Europeans or consult with them about anything, but it is the duty of Europeans to back the United States against China, and and also to follow our lead in normalizing relations with Russia, which I think is a positive thing. But Europeans don't seem inclined at all to follow that path. So this is there are additional features of this which are quite extraordinary. On the one hand, the United States, reasserting the Monroe Doctrine, claims an exemption from any intervention by Europeans in the Western Hemisphere or any influence on American politics, but it asserts the right to interfere in European politics to promote the interests of right-wing populist forces like the Alternative for Deutschland. I don't have anything against the Alternative for Deutschland. I don't agree with its xenophobic anti-immigration stand, but it actually has some sensible positions on German relations with Russia and the Ukraine war, which, it's not warmongering. And, it's interesting to me that Germans are so afraid of their historical shadow that they're unable to reason, apparently. They have to go along with the crowd in Europe. And the crowd, even though Britain has left the EU, appears to be mainly led from London, with Paris occasionally trying to insert itself in the dialogue and not really succeeding. But anyway, I mean, I think Europe is frankly a mess with very weak leadership, policies that are counterproductive, that are debilitating rather than reinvigorating. And I know with as I think we've discussed before, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is an institute that tracks 64 areas of science and technology with regard to determining which countries are in the lead, now says 57 countries are, that China is ahead in 57 categories, South Korea in 2, and the United States in 5. And the momentum is with China. And Europe is not on that list. That is really extraordinary, given that Francis Bacon and others are the founders of modern scientific method, and that Germany, particularly prior to the 1930s, was the undisputed leader of science and technology in the world. Your own country, Switzerland, has a distinguished record of innovation, and yet Europe is not doing what is required to remain competitive. Quite the opposite. It's cutting itself off from Russian resources, which are essential to its competitiveness. It didn't blow up Nord Stream 2. I think the Americans did. But nonetheless, there wasn't any protest from Europe about that. Even Germany, the chancellor went to Washington and stood silent while Biden extolled the virtues of the loss of Russian gas for Germany.
And I thought that was the height of humiliation possible, when a German chancellor stands next to an American president and is just told that we will blow up that infrastructure at will. But then came the Europeans, like all of them rushing to Washington in order to sit in front of the desk of the US president and have themselves photographed. And I think only Meloni realized that she was being humiliated. The others were happy to sit at the desk of the boss. It's just like Europe at this point deserves humiliation, because it invites it. It's like, so I just wonder how long it takes until they realize it.
Europe puts forward no ideas. It asks for more of the same.
Yeah.
It's in favor of continuing war in Ukraine, not addressing the question of how to help Ukrainians survive and reconstitute themselves in a manner that can serve their national interests. It doesn't propose any dialogue. In fact, it carries out no dialogue with Russia at all. It leaves that to the business cronies and son-in-law of Donald Trump. I noticed, interestingly, that Vladimir Putin, after the last 5-hour session with Witkoff and Kushner, said, well, I want to keep this channel going because I want a channel to Donald Trump. But this issue of peace in Ukraine is only going to be solved by Sergei Lavrov and professional diplomats. Well, that was, a sort of a statement. Well, I enjoy talking to Witkoff and Kushner, but in the end, that's not going to produce anything.
I mean, he even, Vladimir Putin also stated that he would actually prefer to solve this on the battlefield, but if it can be solved at the negotiating table, then he will certainly do so. But the process obviously is not one which then leads toward what the Russians would expect, which is like serious, working group to work by working group kind of negotiations. I mean, you as a diplomat can you maybe tell us, I mean, what would it need? I mean, how many people would be involved, and how many issues would these groups have to go through? I mean, it would be huge, wouldn't it, if you actually tried to do it seriously?
Well, it would be extremely complicated because there are multiple interests that have to be brought into accord with whatever solution you're imposing. And you have to deal with the issue of Ukraine as a buffer and bridge between the Russian part of Europe and the rest of Europe. You have to deal with Russian security concerns as well as Western European security concerns. You have to deal with the issue of minority rights in Ukraine, which is what caused the start of the civil strife and eventually led to the invasion. I mean, after the 2014 coup, the actions by the Rada to make the use of Russian illegal for official purposes and to burn Russian books and so forth, the whole Banderite agenda in Ukraine produced a rebellion in eastern Ukraine, and that gradually drew the Russians in, and eventually led to the confrontation at the end of 2021 and the Russian ultimatum: negotiate with us or we'll have to use force. And they were told, no, there will be no negotiation. So they did use force. And, that may be, again, illegal. But it's yet another example of the failure of both diplomacy and legality in that instance, since the West had nothing to offer. And still, if I will say a very sad thing has happened in the United States, and that is the essential destruction of our foreign diplomatic service and its competence. So this is all the more reason for Europeans to take their own future in their own hands. And yet I don't see any leader in Europe. I don't see any competent diplomacy coming from Europe on a question that should be of vital interest to everyone, not just the Russians, who do continue to demand negotiations, and to say, as you said, if there are no negotiations, we'll just settle this on the battlefield, which they will.
And Europe too. I mean, the diplomats are all gone. I mean, the chief diplomat of the European Union, I mean, the political head of that section is Kaja Kallas, and that's a very sad thing. And the United States too. I mean, I have nothing but the greatest respect for the diplomats of the State Department, which have produced great diplomats like yourself, like Ambassador Jack Matlock, so many. I mean, Ambassador Grew in Japan during the second before the Second World War. These were like brilliant thinkers of international relations who deeply understood what they were dealing with. And where did that go? I mean, in the United States, you just said that the service has been taken apart. What happened to the State Department?
Well, we're in an age in which, and the so-called national security strategy really reflects this, in which political theater has replaced strategic reasoning. And so we have a constant incidence of peace agreements that aren't peace agreements, that are signed with great flourishes. Donald Trump claims he's made peace between India and Pakistan, which I can't say that I have seen much evidence of, between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, between Thailand and Cambodia, which are back-bombing each other, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between Israel and Palestinians. Where's the peace? There are ceasefires that paper over the causes of wars, but don't deal with them, and which are not acceptable and not durable to the parties. So what is all this? It's political theater. It is not a serious diplomatic effort. There's no Bismarck out there at the moment.
I mean, it's even worse. I talked the day before yesterday to Anuradha Chenoy from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and she said, "Look, it's an insult to India when the United States says it brokered peace, because its line is that the dispute with Pakistan is bilateral and they will deal with it bilaterally. They do not want a third party in there." So the U.S. president claiming that actually is an insult and an injury. So it's highly
Well,
conflicting.
I think the injury is to Indian egos is all the greater because Pakistan has successfully flattered and appeased Donald Trump
Yeah.
and rebuilt a relationship with the United States, which was very bad, into something close. And meanwhile, of course, the crackpot economic theories of the White House have resulted in uh, tariffs on India, which are crippling to trade. And of course, we're now engaged in trying to cut off Russian oil exports everywhere, including to India. And we've just seen Vladimir Putin in Delhi um, embracing or being embraced by Narendra Modi, which is the answer to this. I mean, I would say actually India, in addition to being humiliated by the claim, the spurious claim that Donald Trump created a peace between them and the Pakistanis, and in addition to seeing Islamabad outdo them in its courtship of Washington,
Yeah.
also has another problem, and that is that was very much in the background during the Putin visit to Delhi. The United States U.S. policy has pushed China and Russia together. Now, in the past, during the Soviet era, India could count on Soviet support in balancing China against China. Can it do so now? Russia has a big stake in not offending the Chinese. And I think India's position as a swing state geopolitically has been compromised. And that when you see Modi and Putin embracing each other, this is a case of they're protesting too much about the affection they have for each other and the strong relationship between the two countries. And I know that the trade relationship between India and Russia is greatly unbalanced. There's no Russian investment going into India, which is what you'd normally expect when a huge surplus in trade in your favor is going on. It's how the United States has dealt with China or India, or in an earlier era, Japan, or Taiwan, or any of the ASEAN countries. When you have a trade surplus, you take the money and invest it in the other party, and you balance the trade. Well, there's almost $100 billion in Russian exports to India, as I recall, and maybe $5 billion in Indian exports to Russia. And yet nothing is happening. And despite all the brave talk, anyway, I think India's swing position has been compromised by geopolitical developments, and it's not fully reflected in Indian policy.
That is true. Although one of the interesting things that Anuradha shared with me is that the trade between Russia and India is 95% is in local currency, and the Russians now hold a lot of rupees, and these rupees are now can be used even to buy government bonds. So they're trying, apparently they are trying to figure out a way in order to make this bilateral trade somewhat more useful.
Because the Russians have many more rupees than they know what to do with, and they don't want them. So now they're looking for some way to deploy those rupees.
And that must be in India.
And well, the obvious way to do it would be to invest in India. But as I said, the Russian companies don't seem to be at all interested in that. And I know from my own experience as the chair of an international business development company that it's not easy to do business in India. India has a very high level of protectionism in its policy, and it has a very bureaucratic system internally. And it is also sometimes very politicized in its approach to foreign investors who get into trouble for one reason or another. And it's If you want to have foreign investment, you've got to make yourself attractive. And India has not really succeeded to the extent it should.
Yeah, so it's definitely not smooth sailing. And I mean, also the comparison between India and China just shows, I mean, they have like comparable population sizes, but they're on completely different planes when it comes to the development of their local economies, right? And maybe let's use this to swing over to another theater that I would very much like to get your opinion on, because there was like now over the last 1 month, this very, in my view, very unfortunate spat or like conflict between Japan and China. And it was kickstarted by Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, who made, in my view, a really, really dumb comment in the Japanese Diet, the Japanese Parliament, when she said that she would consider mainland Chinese using their navy against Taiwan, that she would consider that a reason to activate Japan's that you would consider that an emergent
An existential threat.
an existential threat to Japan. Thank you, and that would allow her to deploy the self-defense forces. Now, this enraged China hugely. How do you interpret that one and what then followed? Because China reacted much more strongly than I thought it would.
Well, I think, first of all, Madam Takaichi made a mistake, which a seasoned politician like her should not make, and that was she responded to a hypothetical question. She should not have done so. But in doing so, she revealed her real attitude, which is quite much on the record. She's been very close to Taiwan and to Taiwan independence forces. And of course, I'm sure your listeners all know, but Japan, one of Japan's first acts in the creation of a Japanese empire after the Meiji Restoration was the conquest of Taiwan. From 1895 to 1945, Taiwan was part of Japan, and the Japanese Navy, after about 25 years of dealing with insurrections and rebellions and so forth, managed to carry out a very effective policy of assimilation of Taiwanese to Japan, so that educated Taiwanese conducted their debates in Japanese, not in the local dialect or in Mandarin. So what was the justification of this Japanese reach out for Taiwan? Well, actually, in part, it was just an adjunct to the invasion of Korea, the displacement of Chinese suzerainty in Korea. But that didn't take full effect until 1905, 10 years after Taiwan. But basically, Japan had been invaded by the Dutch initially from Taiwan. That is, the treaty ports that the Dutch imposed on Japan for a while were imposed from Taiwan. And Japan, when it took Taiwan, saw it, in its own words, as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. That phrase was Japanese originally, not American. And it used Taiwan for that purpose when it conducted its invasion of the Philippines, of Hong Kong, and of Indochina. It launched it from Taiwan. So the Japanese strategic view of Taiwan, which Douglas MacArthur, when he was the effective viceroy in the Japanese army barracks in Tokyo after World War II, accepted, was that Taiwan is strategically very important to Japan. It can be used by Japan against others, but it can also be used by others against Japan. And so all of this is deep in Japanese strategic reasoning, and the Chinese are well aware of it. And of course, Taiwan is still separated from the rest of China, and that is a humiliation to Chinese nationalism. Both revolutions, the 1911 revolution and the 1949 revolution, aimed to eliminate foreign military presence, foreign spheres of influence, and warlords, meaning independent forces who did not accept central government authority from Chinese territory. But in Taiwan, there is still not only a foreign sphere of influence, but American troops now in violation of our agreements with China. So this is a matter of great sensitivity, particularly as China comes, in my view, toward a decision to resolve the Taiwan issue and make Taiwan an offer that it cannot refuse. And that is what all the military demonstrations are about. I don't think the Chinese want a war over Taiwan, although they may be prepared to have one if necessary. But they want to be able to overawe Taiwan and, as Sun Tzu prescribed, win without fighting. So in this context, and this is also related to internal legislation and in the diplomatic record in Tokyo, along comes Takeuchi and basically says Taiwan is part of Japan for Japan's defensive perimeter. It is an attack on Taiwan would justify the deployment of Japanese forces because it would affect Japan's survival. That word is used in earlier language in Japanese policy, and the reinterpretation of Article 9, meaning the pacifist element of the Japanese Constitution, rests on the gradual extension of what is acceptable in terms of collective defense. And collective defense for Japan means joining the United States. And that means joining the United States in an intervention to save Taiwan from its reincorporation into the rest of China. So all this is very alarming to the Chinese. It is strategically significant. The timing of it could hardly be worse because the net effect of Madam Takeuchi, Prime Minister Takeuchi's remarks is to embolden people in Taiwan to avoid negotiations with the mainland and count on the backing of Tokyo as well as Washington in the event that the Chinese decide they have to use force. So this undercuts the entire Chinese strategy for a peaceful settlement. And that is why you are getting the reaction that you're getting. And I think, on the other hand, I would say the Chinese demand that Prime Minister Takeuchi repudiate her own words is politically impossible for her to do. So in what we are basically seeing from China is a demand to Japan that they get rid of Prime Minister Takeuchi, that she be displaced as prime minister, which would allow a fresh start. And that is very, very difficult, but not impossible, given the fragility of her coalition in the Diet.
She has an extremely weak position, although she's currently popular with the population, but also being the first female prime minister. But it's for Japan, it's even worse because the situation before her comment was that there was no decision, right? There was no we would or we wouldn't. Especially Prime Minister Abe did that very strategically, and you will never be able to go back to that.
No, that's true. Well, this is, of course, similar in a way, parallel to the Joe Biden, 4 comments by Joe Biden that in violation of the Taiwan Relations Act, which makes no commitment to defend Taiwan, but makes a commitment to help Taiwan defend itself, pending reunification, if that is the result of negotiations across the strait. This is strategic ambiguity.
Yeah.
Prime Minister Takeuchi just destroyed the strategic ambiguity with which Japan had finessed this issue. And she put it back right in the center. This is, of course, far more consequential than the Ishikawa annexation of the Senkaku by the city of Tokyo, the nationalization of the Senkaku Islands, which had been handled, let's not deal with this. Both sides had agreed. Suddenly, in the no, Hashimoto, I guess,
Yeah.
administration. We got away from finessing it, and now each side is obliged to demonstrate that it has a valid claim to this worthless set of rocks, 5 rocks in the middle of nowhere, with a French name which got translated into Japanese, the Pinnacles, I guess. Anyway, so I mean, um, Japan has a problem with China, with Korea, to some extent with others in Pacific Asia, because it has expressed, um, it has offered apologies without convincing remorse.
Yeah. You know, what I regret the most over here is that Japan, on the one hand, did a very good thing. It said never ever again war, right? And it wrote it into the Constitution, and there's a good paper on it that this is not just an American edition, but the Japanese had a hand in that as well. But
let us remember, however, that Constitution was drafted by Americans, and that the same people, the same families who ran Japan in the era of militarism are now running Japan.
Yeah. True. I'll send you an article, an interesting one that shows like how the Japanese like left-wing pacifists were involved in drafting the Article 9. But beside the point, I wanted to say that this idea that never again war, that's actually, it's very, very strong inside the population. But it also means that all of what happened in the Second World War and all of the suffering is is projected into the war. Even left-wing Japanese today, some and well-meaning, do not understand why the why the Chinese are still so bitter about it. Because war is war, right? Everybody dies. People died in Hiroshima. People died in Nanking. War is war. That's something that.
No, that's the point I'm making. That for a variety of reasons, which are very complex, but which I think in part have their root in the Confucian tradition of Japan, you cannot condemn your ancestors as war criminals. You just can't do that. And so so we've had a whole series of textbook issues and so forth. And how do you characterize what happened? And a great deal of what has been written is exoneratory, not accepting of culpability. And this is read by Koreans and Chinese, and who deeply resent it. I can remember, I remember a textbook controversy when I was the charge in Beijing, and I had a very good friend in the foreign ministry who invited me to a dinner at the Tingliguan, which is the pavilion for listening to orioles out at the Summer Palace. And I was saying to him, I was arguing, and I said, really, you've got to find a way to patch this up. I mean, Japan is far too important a country for you to be emotionally hostile to it in the manner that there were demonstrations going on and so forth. And he was a very calm person. I never saw him ever lose his temper, except this time. And he turned purple in the face, and he said, 5 million dead, and you want me to forget that? My relatives died. You want me to forget that? And, I realized, we don't have the kind of, obsession among Chinese or Koreans, for that matter, that one has among European Jews over the Holocaust. But the feelings are just, the trauma is just as great. And, Japan has been unable to deal with this.
Yeah.
I have many Japanese friends. I understand their difficulties, but I don't, I think Japanese politics has been unable to come to grips with the legacy of empire building.
Yeah. And it's also a consequence out of, the necessity of transforming the former arch enemy, the United States, into the main ally. I mean, somehow you have to rationalize that, right? And the way to do it is to say, like, war itself is the problem, but that exonerates you from what happened, from what you did before. And this is a huge issue. And I wonder what can be done in order to patch this up between China and Japan, because
well, I think one thing, Pascal, that is missing is in the past, and I'm talking now about the era when I was in Beijing as charge, and before that, in the 70s and the 80s. There were Japanese elders and Chinese elders who were not officials, but they were former officials. Perhaps they were prominent individuals who conducted an off-camera dialogue, and who had mutual confidence. I mean, they understood each other and they were able to contrive solutions to problems. I mean, of course, they didn't solve the problem. They put Band-Aids on the problem rather than staunching the wounds. But they kept the relationship from going off the tracks, which it has now done, basically. I mean, at the moment, there's no obvious off-ramp, except the resignation of Prime Minister the Prime Minister. So Takaichi. So I think this is a very bad situation, because among other things, if indeed that is the only solution, Japanese will be humiliated by that, and the humiliating Japanese is not a good idea.
No, but some people are saying that the Americans might have had a hand in this, like Donald Trump, since she met Donald Trump only like 2 weeks before what she said. I don't believe so. I believe this was her slip of the tongue, basically. But do you think the U.S. is in any way, shape, or form involved in this dispute?
No, I think the U.S. has been holding back and basically counseling both sides, as I tried to do in the incident at the Tingliguan that I mentioned, to tone it down and find a solution. And that this is particularly the case because part of the Trump administration dismantling of the world order in the national security strategy document that we were discussing earlier involves in the European theater, normalizing relations with Russia, and in the Asian theater, treating China as an economic competitor, and rather than in military terms. So the U.S. is quite ambivalent on the Taiwan issue under the Trump administration. And I note that President Trump, whose vanity is immense, wants to be feted in Beijing in April. And that means nothing's going to happen to offend China that he has any control over. Of course, he doesn't have full control over his own administration, but nothing's going to happen prior to April to produce a confrontation between the United States and China. Mm-hmm. So in this context, I think many Japanese are uncomfortable with the lack of strong backing from the United States. And but I think you can understand why that is the case.
Yes, of course. The Japan is in a very bad situation now, out of its own making. But maybe if we can use the last 5 minutes to go back to the issue of Taiwan. I wrote a paper some months, a year ago, about that in order for Taiwan and China, or for the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China, in order to have a common future that doesn't end in war, what you need is not necessarily a solution, but what you need is a minimum which both parties would not be able to say no to. What do you think is kind of the minimum requirement for the People's Republic of China, for the mainland, to kind of continue with a policy of non-lethal force against the island?
Yeah, well, actually, we had such a formula when both sides agreed that there was only one China, although they had different interpretations of what that
1992 consensus.
But that was destroyed by the Minjindang, the Democratic People's Party in Taiwan, the DPP, and Lai Ching-te, who's the current leader in Taiwan, doesn't appear to have any sense of the importance of that to maintain peace. The basic point of that was that it gave the mainland a reason to kick the can down the road. In other words, if you think reunification is the right thing and it's inevitable, and both sides agree that there's only one China, but they disagree about some details, then you can make all kinds of compromises. So in the Ma Ying-jeou era, when he was the leader in Taiwan, he actually met in Singapore with Xi Jinping. But there were other things being discussed which didn't come to fruition. For example, they were talking, offline about things like, well, Taipei, you represent China because nobody recognizes Taiwan as a country. They recognize Taipei as the government of China, if they recognize it at all. So you have representation in Guatemala, for example. Why don't we do a deal where you have representation, you provide consular services to all Chinese people in Taiwan and the mainland, and we'll do the same for you in Brazil, where we have relations. And they were talking about this kind of thing. It was very pragmatic, and unfortunately, the independence movements in Taiwan, which represents identity politics, very familiar thing in the modern age, overwhelmed those talks and those understandings. So now we have there's a tradition started by Li Denghui, who was actually Kuomintang, but very much in favor of independence. And by the way, he thought he was Japanese until he was 20. And Japanese who spoke with him have told me that he spoke like a Japanese from the 1930s, very elegant, formal Japanese of a sort that is not used today. His Mandarin was lousy. I met with him many times, and he was a Hakka. He spoke very good Hakka and very good Hokkien, the Taiwan dialect. Anyway, he started this with he picked a moment in July of 1999 to go on the Deutsche Welle. He chose that instrument very carefully to say there are two states, but that doesn't preclude they're coming together in the future, of something that Germans would understand,
right?
Because of East and West Germany reuniting. But this was seen correctly by people in Beijing as a declaration of independence. Now there are two states. So this is the root of the DPP thesis that eventually led them to repudiate the One China doctrine, which had been the legal fiction, if you will, that facilitated political intercourse across the strait and gave Beijing a reason not to prepare to take Taiwan by force. So it's interesting. Up until 1999, when Li Denghui announced this two-state doctrine, China didn't build a single landing craft. They made no effort. Rhetorically, they were all about liberating Taiwan from the Kuomintang, but in fact, they did nothing. After that, they began the course of military modernization directed at Taiwan, which has now produced an overwhelming Chinese military advantage in the Taiwan Strait. If U.S. and Japan go to war over Taiwan with China, we are going to be very badly damaged. So will the Chinese, but they have a capacity to rebuild that we don't.
Yeah.
So this is your question is a good one, but I don't know how we get back to this. I think the Chinese would be satisfied with an arrangement that made reunification the logical result of delay.
Yeah.
But if the logical result of delay is increased commitments by Japan and the United States to maintain the separation of Taiwan from the mainland, which is what Takaichi's statement appeared to mean, then I don't think we have a basis for continued peace.
What's the minimum viable product or project that would not lead to force? I do hope they find it. Because like in a sense, like the legal fiction that you talked about is brilliant, isn't it? It's like both parties accept it for different reasons, and it maintains the peace, even though it doesn't solve the problem. It's like in IT, when you have a bug, either you fix the bug or you do a workaround. You create a workaround that actually patches up the issue. It's like,
well, this is very Chinese. I've often said, thinking of the Senkaku or Jiaoyutao issue, that if the Japanese were Chinese, they'd figure out something to live with this situation. So if you remember, Jiman, Mazu, Quemoy, and Mazu, which are part of Fujian province, the Chinese on either side of the war there, the Civil War, fired at each other on alternate days. Mm-hmm. So Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, the Chinese communists fired at the Kuomintang, and Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, the Kuomintang fired back. And so everybody kept the fiction of a war alive, but nobody was killing anybody, and this is, so, Chinese are very capable of coming up with creative solutions.
Yeah.
Here's the major obstacle, and this is why, again, Takaichi's comment is so damaging. The Chinese see Americans and now Japanese fostering a reluctance to discuss any kind of arrangement across the strait. And we like the status quo, which is Taiwan is independent, anti-communist, aligned with us. And in the case of Taiwanese relations with Japan, many Taiwanese have very fond feelings for Japan and vice versa. This is quite a distinction. And again, it goes back to the fact that the Japanese Navy, not the Guangdong Army, was running Taiwan. The Guangdong Army in Korea managed to create undying enmity, apparently. But in the case of Taiwan, the reaction was affection.
And it's also historical memory that just works in different ways. I mean, the Japanese also created a lot of, quite a harm on Singapore, for instance, but Singaporean-Japanese relations are excellent.
No, I mean, people do, as someone said in the context of war in Gaza, stuff happens, but, it doesn't excuse it.
No.
I will send you something I actually wrote on a long flight from Washington to Taipei called Same Strait, Different Dreams, about the attitudes of people from the mainland, people on Taiwan, Japanese, Americans, about, what this situation is and how it came about. And you might find it interesting. I'll see if I can dig out a copy of it. It is published. But I don't have a copy of the published version handy.
If you can send it to me, I'll also try to make it available for other people who would like to read it. I always ask people where they should go in order to find you. I mean, you, Ambassador Freeman, you have your own homepage where you actually collect all of your writings as well. So I will direct everybody there. Is there another place where people should go to find your writings?
No, but I think on the issue of U.S.-China relations, the talk I gave at Brown University about a week ago, it is worth watching. There is a video of it or reading it. Because we haven't talked about U.S.-China relations really, but the effort to reduce tensions, to deal with economic issues alone, is a very perilous enterprise. It's maybe not going to work. There are underlying security issues that are very serious, some of which we've been talking about. So I talked about these pretty bluntly, and I assume you've seen that.
Yes, I did. And also the text that you wrote. I will direct people to it, and I will also send out copies via Substack. Ambassador Chas Freeman, thank you so much for your time today.
Have a great day, Pascal.
You too.